Today we're going to talk about carbohydrates, and the goal of this video is to describe the chemical structure and function of carbohydrates, explain how carbohydrates are built and broken down, and give examples of carbohydrates in nature. Let's begin this discussion with this question. Is sugar good for you? You may have heard sugar is bad for you, but that's not exactly true. Yes, consuming high levels of sugar can have negative health effects, but sugars are essential to the survival of living organisms. Now, this video is supposed to be about carbohydrates, so why am I telling you about sugar? Well, sugars are carbohydrates. So let's say a little bit more about what exactly carbohydrates are. They are a type of organic compound. And by the word organic compound, I mean a substance that contains carbon that's bonded to another carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and or nitrogen. So look at the image on the screen here. The black balls are carbons, okay? And you'll see that there are carbon-carbon bonds. So there's one black ball bonded to another black ball. There are carbon-hydrogen bonds. So that's a black ball bonded to a white ball. And there are carbon-oxygen bonds. That's a black ball bonded to a red ball. So as long as you have these types of bonds, carbon-carbon bonds, carbon-hydrogen bonds, carbon-oxygen bonds, you've got an organic compound. Okay, so carbohydrates are organic compounds, and as I mentioned a moment ago, there are several types of organic compounds, but one type of organic compound are sugars, and that's what carbohydrates are. Carbohydrates are sugars. Now, all carbohydrates are made out of the monomer called monosaccharides. So, what is a monomer and what is a monosaccharide? A monomer is just a building block. So, think of like a single Lego. That's like a single building block. And the building block that carbohydrates are made out of are called monosaccharides. The mono means one, the saccharide means sugar. These are simple sugars because they're just a single building block. So there are three types of monosaccharides: glucose, galactose, and fructose. If you look at all three monosaccharides, there are three elements that they have in common. C is for carbon, they all have C's. H is for hydrogen, they all have H's. And O is for oxygen, they all have O's in them. Now, if you count how many C's and how many H's and how many O's, you'll see that glucose has 6 C's, 12 H's, and 6 O's. But so does galactose. However, they differ slightly in their structures. Both glucose and galactose have a hexagon shaped ring, but one of the OHs is in a different place. When this happens, when you have something with the same chemical formula, C6H12O6, but the structures are slightly different, they're called isomers. Now let's look at fructose. It turns out to have the same chemical formula as well, but again, you'll notice something different about its structure. The C's are not all in the same places, and in fact, the ring is a pentagon rather than a hexagon. But the important takeaway that I want you to see here is they all have the same chemical formula, and they're all made out of a single ring structure. Yes, the ring may be hexagon or pentagon, but it's a single ring structure. That's the mono part of monosaccharide. Now let's talk about disaccharides. There are three types of disaccharides: sucrose, lactose, and maltose. Disaccharides are formed by the joining of two monosaccharides. So when you look at the image of a disaccharide, you'll actually see two rings, not just one. A sucrose actually turns out to be made of two monosaccharides, a glucose and a fructose. Lactose is made out of two monosaccharides, a glucose and a galactose. And maltose is made out of two monosaccharides, a glucose and a glucose. So, how do you build a carbohydrate? Well, they are formed by simple sugars binding together into a chain. And these simple sugars are joined in a process called dehydration synthesis. The image on the screen here shows you what's happening during dehydration synthesis. So let me try to walk you through what's going on. If you look at the arrow in the middle, on the left side of that arrow are the reactants. This is what you start the reaction with. And on the right side of the arrow, you have the products. That's what you end with. So notice we have two glucose molecules on the left side of the arrow. Both glucose molecules have an OH on them. That's what is outlined in the blue circle there. So what happens during the reaction is an OH from one of the glucose molecules and an H from the other glucose molecule are removed. And when those two are removed, they join together and they form H2O. That's what you see on the far right side of the arrow. Then the O that remains forms a bond with both of those glucose molecules, which connects them into one new molecule, a disaccharide, maltose. So that's what's happening during dehydration synthesis. An OH and an H are removed. That forms water, H2O. And what's left behind forms a bond with both molecules, and the molecules are joined. It helps to see this in action. So here you see that every time you add a new glucose molecule, an H2O falls out. So I'll let you see it one more time. You have an OH and an OH. An OH is removed and an H is removed. They come together and form water. And the O that's left behind forms a bond with both. And you get this nice long chain. The long chain is a carbohydrate. Okay, now how do you break down a carbohydrate? I told you how to build one, but now how do you break it down? Well, a carbohydrate is a complex sugar. Complex sugars are separated into these smaller subunits in a process called hydrolysis. Okay, that word hydro at the beginning, hydrolysis, the word hydro just means water, and lysis means you separate or split it apart. Think of like slicing something apart. So you're using water to break something down, cut it into pieces, slice it apart. Okay, so again, look at the arrow. On the left side, you have the reactants. On the right side of the arrow, you have the products. So notice this time we're starting with a disaccharide, maltose. And when you add water, that water is separated into an OH and an H. The OH binds to one of the molecules, and an H binds to the other. And that's what breaks this bond and releases energy. And now you have two monosaccharides, even though you started with a disaccharide. All right, we'll finish up by talking about the function of carbohydrates. What do carbohydrates do? They store energy and form the structure of living things. So here are some examples of carbohydrates. Starch is used by plants to store energy. Potatoes are an example. They're very high in starch, and the starch is a source of energy for the potato. Glycogen is used by animals to store energy. Humans store glycogen in liver cells. Cellulose is used by plants to form rigid walls around cells. So each square you see in the image there is a cell, and it's surrounded by this thick cell wall made out of cellulose, which is a type of carbohydrate. And then last, you have chitin. Chitin is used by some animals to form an external skeleton, which is the case with this grasshopper. Its exoskeleton is made out of chitin, and that chitin is a type of carbohydrate. So to sum up, we've seen the structure and function of carbohydrates, and we've talked about how carbohydrates are built and how they are broken down.